Third, the financialization of our economy. What do I mean by that? Well, you might think that what I mean by that is that, you know, I think finance is bad, and so if lots of people are doing finance, that must be bad. Actually, I think finance is kind of interesting. I've spent most of my career mucking around in finance, and in one form or another, and it's a vital function in our economy. However, financial activity is an intermediary function. It probably shouldn't be doing things like comprising 40% of the net profits of the S&P 500, as it was in 2006, or contributing somewhere on the order of 25% of GDP, as some people have estimated it was during the same period. That sounds like a very expensive kind of intermediation. As the president of the AFL-CIO likes to say, finance should be the servant of the real economy and not its master, or not itself. Not the real economy and finance shouldn't be the same, shouldn't sort of merge into one thing. Meaning, you know, we shouldn't substitute finance for the real economy. Now, that economic strategy, that financialization, which we indulged in and which, you know, the United Kingdom did and Iceland did, that strategy has certain appeals in a globalized world. You know, and it can be kind of hard to wean ourselves from it. But let me suggest that while that strategy could work, I think, in theory for very small societies, very highly urbanized, a society like Singapore, for example, or the Netherlands, maybe. There's some history of that kind of thing working for those societies, that we have 300 million people, and we can't all be financiers. And let me suggest something further, sort of humbling thing. It's not clear why the rest of the world would necessarily want us to be their financer. Right? Why the rest of the world would all bring all their financial problems to us as opposed to wanting to handle them for themselves. Not clear what our fundamentally and ultimately our comparative advantage would be that would generate that. There's some reason to believe that that countries that with really successful economies like to kind of have the finance function of their own. So that's kind of not a viable strategy, and yet I think there is some basis to believe that we continue to pursue it. And I, you know, could talk at length about that in the context of TARP, but I'm not going to. And finally, our approach to the way in which we source and use energy, its impact on our climate, it's our ability to finance it over time, which has receded a bit as a subject matter right now as global energy demand fell during the economic crisis, but I guarantee you will come back. That's both a big problem and a large opportunity. And the problem is that the way we've kind of done things is not sustainable or wise. The opportunity is that the worldwide challenge here is the kind of problem solving which a large society could undertake and which could be something that we might sell the rest of the world, which would be good for us. Unfortunately, as Harold referred to, the current trend seems to be the other way around. The rest of the world may sell the solution to us. It's not clear how that's going to contribute to solving some of the other things I just mentioned. Now, how do these four problems relate to capital, labor, and government? The labor movement and the business community seems to me have a joint interest in solving these problems. Government can either be an enabler of the perpetuation of them or an aid to resolving them. So there are some things we kind of need to do together rather than apart. One of them, I think, is that we need a strategy for our nation that is viable in a global economy. I think it's pretty clear that we are not going to not have a global economy. I think it's pretty clear that nations like India and China are going to be increasingly important, not less important. I think it's pretty clear that they know how to do things, a lot of things really well, and that they're learning to do more. And then I think the question is, what are we going to do in that economy, in that global economy, and how will it maintain the kind of society we want to live in? And I'm going to close by, because I think I've kind of run the rough amount of time I've been allocated. I'm going to close by saying, in relation to this, what do I mean by the kind of society we want to live in? one of the outcomes of the changes in the way that America's labor markets and capital market regulation, the changes that occurred in the 1930s, one of the outcomes of those changes was that the fundamental nature of distribution of wealth and power in the United States changed, and the way in which Americans interacted with each other as a result changed. What do I mean by that? I mean that labor relations, prior to the 1930s, were conducted in a manner that I would say was certainly very colorful. It was, what does Amity say, it was very romantic? It was very romantic unless you were actually burying the people who were killed. It was a rough and tumble society. It was not a society where I would say the rule of law was really that prevalent. I mean, you know, we had laws and courts and all that, but you know, there were whole movements trying to make sure that they actually functioned in something with some level of integrity. It was a society of profound inequalities of wealth and power. It was a society sort of, in many ways, much more like the kind of scene that I saw once when I visited Brazil. The kind of scene where, you know, people are afraid to call the police because the police are so poorly paid that if you call them, they will rob you. I mean, that's what it's like there. It's a society where anyone who has anything is fortified. You know what I mean by fortified? I mean they've got iron gates around their homes. I don't mean rich people. I mean anybody who's got anything. Right? Our society was not quite that bad before the Depression, but it was a lot more like that than it became after the Depression. And the kinds of social conflict that are engendered by, what's that, labor market flexibility? You know what happens when you go to a bunch of people who do something like, you know, work in a mine and say to them, oh, we need labor market flexibility, and as a result, we're cutting your wages by a half because, you know, wages got to fall because, you know, production is down and all that. That was routine in America before the Depression. You know what those people tend to do in response to that? You think they sort of say, oh, you know, I guess I got to suck it up, as a textile executive once said to me. You just got to suck it up. I think that's what they do. If you've read the history of these things, that is not what they do. They do all kinds of other things, but mostly they don't suck it up. And the kinds of things that they do when you threaten their family with starvation, right, are not the kind of things that you'd really want to have your society founded on. But you have a certain level of social conflict, that's the way it's going to be. Now, I'm not saying we're anywhere near that. I'm not saying we're anywhere near that. In fact, we're not. But we could be. That could be the kind of society we bequeath to our children. I really don't want to do that. I really think we ought not to do that. I really think that we ought not to have the kind of society where economic downturns mean that people get asked to have their wages cut in half and then have to ponder what their options are when that happens. And so I think we need to deal with these four structural problems. And we need to have a strategy for what the United States will be in a globalized economy. By the way, if you want to see the kind of thing I'm talking about, check out what happens in China, right, when people have disagreements about things, when people's wages get cut. Right? It's deeply destabilizing. Right? And so the challenge to us is, how are we going to take on these four big problems together? We are the inheritors of the society that was built after the New Deal that has structures for dealing with these kinds of challenges together. They haven't worked very well. They haven't worked very well recently. That's why these problems are persistent. But we could deal with them together. And you know, much of my hope for the Obama administration is that I think our president is committed to trying to do that. It's unclear right now, I would say, whether or not our political system, and I don't think this is any particular side's fault, it's unclear to me whether our political system is really going to be able to realize that ambition. Thank you.